Hi Year 10, welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast. Today we're talking to you about the poem Sing Song by Daljit Nagra. So make sure that you've got a copy of the poem in front of you before you start to listen to this, please. If you need to take a minute now to pause the podcast and go and get everything that you need, do so now. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through the poem and to have a look yourself. We're going to start today a little bit about what the poem's about. So we're going to start at the top and talk about what seems to be happening in each of the stanzas. So I'll start. I can see at the start that we've got a speaker who is talking about running his dad's shop, and we get the impression it's a corner shop. He's there all day long from 9 o'clock to 9 o'clock. But actually, he doesn't seem to particularly take it very seriously. He doesn't seem to work very hard because every time his dad's back is turned, he goes upstairs with his bride. And when he returns down to the shop and opens it up again, there's lots of angry customers outside who seem to be shouting at him and telling him this is the worst shop ever. So to summarise, in the first few stanzas, his dad seems to have lots of expectations on him to work very hard, but he doesn't seem to want to work very hard at all. Then we move on to talking about the bride in a bit more detail, don't we? So what do we learn about the bride?
Okay, well, the first things we realise from the fourth stanza is that when she's upstairs, where they live, she's on a Sikh lover site. So this could be either she's having an affair or looking for someone else, or she herself runs a lover site and she tries to get people together. After that, we get a bit more information about the bride specifically. So we understand that she doesn't really get along with the speaker's parents. So she swears at his mom and she makes fun of his dad. So we can see that there's some sort of tension and problems. She's also seen to have the eyes of a gun. So this might suggest that she's quite strong or aggressive, perhaps, or she has something inside that she can't always see. And also she's trying to mix in the two cultures. So she wears a sari, but it's tartan, and she has very short, a crew cut red hair. So she's not a typical, perhaps, Indian, or what you'd expect a typical Indian to look like, because she seems to have embedded a lot of Western or British cultural aspects to her own life.
Then when we get towards the end of the poem, we've got a bit of a return to the shop. So we can see in the slanty writing in italics, we've got a sort of return to the angry customers outside the shop, maybe suggesting that these are a bit of a constant in his life, a bit of an interruption that he's always having to deal with and he always gets a bit frustrated by. But then at the end of the poem, it turns quite romantic and it talks about how when it's midnight, the speaker and his wife creep down to the shop and they sit together in the corner shop, and they sit together and they perhaps talk to each other and they have a whispered conversation. And right at the end of the poem, there's a bit of a conversation between them. So we've got pairs of couplets, pairs of two lines together, and we can see that they're talking to each other. So it's almost a very romantic scene to end the poem on. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about what the poem is about. We're just going to talk a little bit about the poet's life, because there's quite a lot that we can talk about here that would help us to understand the poem even better. So Daljit Nagra, the poet, is an Indian and is the son of first-generation immigrants, which means that they moved to the UK, had never lived here before, and moved completely from a different culture to this one. So that would have been a very difficult experience. It's very difficult today. Something that you have to remember about this poem is that when it's set, it would have been even harder, because nowadays Britain is very multicultural, which means you've got lots of different people from all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different religions and cultures and races who all live together. And we know that from the city that we live in. But Britain wasn't always like that. And for the first immigrants that arrived to Britain, they were arriving to a country that was mostly white, mostly Christian, and had very different values to traditional Indian ones. So that would have been really hard, and families would have faced a lot of racism, a lot of prejudice, a lot of people perhaps making fun of them for being different. So there's quite a lot of evidence in this poem that those experiences were perhaps things that the speaker in the poem is experiencing themselves.
And they also had a lot of hardships that they had to overcome because they came to this country for a better life. So a lot of them wanted to set up their own businesses, and the poet's parents actually were shopkeepers. And so you could say that this is based on his real life and his parents. And although his parents wanted a better life here, and it was all about being financially stable, you can see in the poem he doesn't care that much about that. He wants love. So his ideas and his parents' ideas have changed throughout time.
So there's a couple of bits of the poem that we want to draw your attention to. When you're writing about the language in this poem, there's lots you could write about. So, I mean, it's a really long poem, so we're just going to pick up on two things that would be really good things to talk about. First of all, we can look at the way that he describes his bride. Because there's lots of description here that we could use. I want to draw your attention to stanza number 6 in particular, where the speaker says, "My bride, tiny eyes of a gun and the tummy of a teddy." So what we have there are two metaphors. Tiny eyes of a gun implies to us that the wife perhaps has a very kind of hard and perhaps aggressive side to her, as Mr. Rafi said earlier. It perhaps implies that she has to be quite tough, which would maybe link into the ideas that we were talking about racism and prejudice in the UK. But this is contrasted with a softer side. You know, he says that she has the tummy of a teddy, which implies that she's really soft, she's really cuddly, but perhaps that's a side that she only really reveals to him. So there's lots that you can unpick there with just that one quote. The fact that we've got a language device, we've got the use of metaphors, but we've also got the juxtaposition between those images as well, which is a structural feature. What about the rhyming couplets at the end? That's another structural, sorry, they're not rhyming couplets, that's my mistake. We've got the use of couplets at the end. So if you turn to the end of the poem, Yatem, and look at the last 8 lines, you'll see they come in pairs. And those pairs are called couplets in poetry. And we can see if we read through them that we have the speaker starting off, but then we have his wife, his bride, replying. So they're having a conversation with each other. So another point perhaps you could make is that they, in this part of the poem, the fact that they're taking turns speaking and that they're using couplets, so they're using lines of the same length and the same types of poetry to speak to each other, perhaps suggests that they are very well matched, that they love each other very much, and that they're being quite romantic because they're copying what each other are doing and they're mirroring each other. So that's definitely something else that you could talk about in terms of structure. Is there anything else that we'd like to add? So just one more thing that I would like to say is if you have a look at the 5th stanza from the end, so just before those rhyming couplets, look at all of the different imagery that we have here, suggesting that this is a really precious location. So for example, you have on line 5 of that stanza, "my silver stool." That's where she sits. You think about that adjective silver. Silver is a metal that is precious, that is shiny, that somebody would treasure. So that would be a really good word to comment on if you're thinking about how he views his wife. She sits on a silver stool. She's almost like a princess or a queen to him because she's precious. Okay, one last thing that we'd like you to think about year 10 is which poems you might want to link this to. And actually this is quite a special poem in the anthology because it's the only poem that talks about family, because we've got the relationship with the parents being explored, but you've also got the romantic love as well with his bride. So actually, you could link this poem to all of the poems in the anthology. So if you're thinking, I'm going to really struggle to remember 15 poems, this one is one that you could link to any other poem in an exam. So this is a really good one to know really, really well. Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. Make sure you tune in next week when we'll be discussing the next poem. But otherwise, that's all we have time for today. So goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.